Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm Kimberly Hoganson, Director of Annual Membership Programs and Operations at the MFA. We're delighted that you were able to join us for tonight's lecture. We appreciate your support and your participation in the MFA's virtual member lecture series. This program is coming to you virtually from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. Before I introduce our speaker, a few logistical notes. A transcript and closed captions are available during this program. To enable closed captions, go to the bottom of the Zoom screen and click the up arrow button next to Show Captions. During the presentation, please use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions and share comments. Please note that this lecture is being recorded and will be available on the MFA's YouTube channel in a few weeks. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Michelle Miller-Fisher is the Ronald C. and Anita L. Wornick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts within the Contemporary Art Department at the MFA. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, and the material world. At the MFA, she is working on her next book and exhibition, tentatively titled Craft Schools, Where We Make What We Inherit, a project that has taken her across 48 contiguous U.S. states by a train over the course of a year. The recipient of an MA and an M.Philosophy in Art History from the University of Glasgow, Scotland, she received an M.Philosophy from and is currently completing her doctorate in art history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Thank you, Michelle, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kimberly, and thank you to Clover and Randy and everybody who made this evening's lecture possible. And also thank you to everybody who's here on the webinar. It's so lovely to be here with you. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes or so on Tender Loving Care, Contemporary Art from the Collection, which is our current exhibition that's up in the Contemporary Galleries in the Lindy Wing at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And many of you may have seen it actually already. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview just for those of you who may not have been in recently or may not have been in at all. But what I'd really like to do in this 30 minutes is to take you into some of the behind the scenes elements of putting this exhibition together. And I'll try and incorporate that in my conversation as I tell you a bit about the overview of the exhibition. But then I want to focus in the latter part of this talk on two elements that were so very important to the realization of this exhibition. My conservation colleagues, without whom this exhibition simply wouldn't have been possible. And then to tell you a little bit more about works that are going to be rotated in this coming July. But I'll start off first with an overview of the exhibition itself. So some of you, as I said, may have been in the Lindy Wing over the last 10 months, and if so, you will have seen this entranceway to Tender Loving Care, Contemporary Art from the Collection. This is a really exciting moment for us to open this last summer. Because, as again, many of you will be aware if you are members and you come into the museum with some frequency over the last couple of years, the Contemporary Galleries, the Lindy Wing, hasn't actually been used for contemporary art over the last couple of years in its truest sense, at least. And there were some mitigating circumstances for that. During the pandemic, when we had a unidirectional pathway, time tickets just after the museum opened up again, we used this space actually to show our Impressionist collection that were Monets, and they looked very handsome in this particular suite of galleries. And then after that, we, of course, had the really wonderful Gustin exhibition. And then after that, the equally fantastic Cy Twombly and the Ancient World exhibition. So we've had some great shows in here. But when we got the word that we were able to reinstall the contemporary collection, the real reason these galleries exist, we were particularly excited. And we heard that in the spring of 2022. And so at the time, myself and our really wonderful former curatorial assistant, Kendall DeBoer, were given the task of thinking about what our contemporary collection rehang would be like to open up these galleries again for their true purpose. And it gave us a really phenomenal excuse, really, or reason, rationale, to look through the contemporary collection that we have at the museum. In July, I will have been at the museum for 5 years, but a few of those years were pretty unusual because of the pandemic. It was hard to get into our collection storage. Some of those years we could not be on site. Kendall was very new as well. I think she'd been at the museum for less than 6 months when we were given this project. And so this was, as I said, sort of a phenomenal chance to really dig through our collection. And dig we did. We used TMS, or the museum system, to go through the contemporary works that we had again and again and again, using different search terms, using different search parameters, years, geography of artist, type of media. And so this was really a true kind of search through the collection, a way for us to get to know it very clearly. It's about 8,000 square feet of space in the Lindy Galleries, so it's not a small space to cover for an exhibition. It's just under what you would have as a special exhibition space to fill in the Gund Galleries. And so we needed to find a theme for the exhibition that was both generous and generative. It needed to be wide enough. We weren't making a special exhibition, so we couldn't come up with a thesis and then borrow works from across the world to support it. This had to be something that came from our vaults, our holdings at the museum. And so very early on in the process, actually, Kendall really beautifully brought in a dictionary definition of care. And she said, I wonder if we could use this as the basis for how we might think through the collection, to use it as a lens onto our explorations through the museum databases, and then later the offsite visits we did to works in storage. And indeed, we took that dictionary definition of care because we really loved the etymological evolution of it over time. We might think of care today in warm and fuzzy terms. It might be a term that we identify with maybe differently and in unique ways, but certainly in a sense of taking care of something, self-care perhaps, something that is generous and care-filled. But at its very root, the word itself, although these are now obsolete meanings, to care for something also at some points in time has meant to grieve for, or to lament for, or to be melancholic about, to care so much for something that grief can be possible. And we thought that that was a pretty good idea, or good theme, or good lens to take on the collection at a moment in time that was still fairly complex in terms of memories and experiences from the pandemic, as we started to think about this exhibition in spring of 22. And so that eventually evolved into the big idea that you see here, tender loving care, thinking about the ways in which artists care enough in order to make artworks. They have to care enough about something, an idea, a material, a piece of history, a personal scenario, in order to generate an artwork in the first place. We also thought about the ways that museum staff care for these works. This exhibition was truly a phenomenal undertaking. Over 100 people's hands from multiple departments across the museum touched this project as it came to life over a year and a half. And then, of course, we thought about audiences who came to the museum, the way in which care is evidenced by the attentiveness of people who come through the galleries and care enough to be in these spaces and to commune with the works and to think about the reasons why they're here in the museum collection in the first place, and artists have made them in the first place. And so this was the idea that underpins the exhibition. We also, though, really wanted to think about this as a space for experimentation. Right from the beginning, this was slightly an unusual undertaking, at least for exhibitions that have perhaps been in this space in the contemporary galleries before. From our very first meeting, it wasn't just Kendall and myself as the curators in the room thinking about the checklist and how this might evolve into an exhibition that people came into the galleries to see. We were joined from that first meeting and every subsequent meeting by some really phenomenal colleagues from across the museum departments. We were joined by Jessica and Ronit from our access programs. We were joined by Dahlia and other colleagues from our education and community learning programs. We were joined by Catherine and Jordan from our interpretation program. And then we were always joined by Sana, our exhibition designer, and Nick, who is our graphic designer. And so together we thought about what the experience might be like from the very beginning of coming into these galleries. We wanted there to be cross-media. The MFA has always been very committed to thinking of contemporary art in all of its manifestations, and that includes things like contemporary craft. We have for many decades collected in medium-specific areas like ceramics or glass or fiber, for example. We wanted to invite, as it says here, visitor intuition. We wanted people to be able to come into this space and to see the works and not necessarily have to read a label first, but to use their own interest and visual delight to see what they were drawn towards. Because we used works from across media, we actually had to have the lights a little dimmer. So if you've been in these galleries, you'll notice there's a little bit of a sort of an energy shift when you come into this space. Things that are light sensitive, including photography, prints, and fiber, need to be at a slightly lower light than some of the paintings, for example, that might usually occupy this space. We also wanted it to not feel like a white cube. We wanted it to feel a bit more warm, perhaps even slightly domestic. And so Sana came up with this really wonderful, very simple, but very effective mode of curtaining off elements to give us these semicircles that kind of gave us small wombs or cocoons around the different thematic areas in the exhibition. And then because we were joined by interpretation and access right from the beginning, in one of our earliest meetings, we were able to say to them, what do you wish happened in these galleries more often? And Jessica said, well, I wish there was more seating. And so as you'll see, as I go through, we have liberally included the Please Be Seated program that has been at the museum since 1975 and commissions makers to create furniture, benches, seats, other things that museum visitors can sit on, but also become part of our collection. And then Jessica also said, I often create large format print materials for those who are hard of sight, so they can read the labels and can read them at larger font and maybe at their leisure handheld. But I wish that was part of the overall graphic design of the exhibition. And so we actually created what you see here, which is a booklet of labels. And so right from the beginning of the exhibition, if you want to wander through yourself and take your time, maybe use that intuitive mode first, and then come to the written material on a particular object of your choice. You can do so through using this booklet and also through a QR code if you prefer to do it digitally. So as you can see here, the exhibition consists of around 100 artists. About 85 of them haven't been on display before at the museum. They're either really deep cuts from our collection, part of our digging through TMS, going offsite, talking to our colleagues across departments, figuring out what hadn't been shown in the galleries for a long time. Or, as I'll point out, there's some really new acquisitions as well. So this was an opportunity for us to both discover the collections ourselves, but hopefully to have audiences rediscover these collections too. We know there are many loyal audience members who come to the museum's galleries often. They know our collections well, and we wanted to be able to show them things that perhaps they had never seen or hadn't seen, at least in these galleries, in a very long time. We were also thoughtful about the stories that we were telling and bringing into these spaces. And so the representation of BIPOC artists is about 40% in the galleries at the moment. And it just so happened that the breakdown, when we calculated it, once we had finalized the exhibition checklist, was pretty heavily female-centric as well. So women identifying artists make up about 70% of the artists on display. And as I said, this is a cross-media display, so there's a significant percentage of works on display that are craft oriented. So I know that some folks will have been into these exhibition galleries recently and may know them intimately, but for those of you who don't, I wanted to include a very brief overview of how we organize the exhibition. We created 6 themes, very loose themes, around this larger umbrella of care. And the first one was this notion of welcome, care meaning many different things, but hopefully allowing artists to help us tease out their possible meanings through the artworks that we included. And so in the first welcome gallery, we have a number of works, paintings, benches from the Please Be Seated collection, very small collaged works as well that help us think about care at both global and local levels, at personal and larger social levels. And then we have this transition artwork, which I really love. It's by Deirdrick Brackens, who is still very young. He's in his early 30s. And it helps us transition from this welcome section into what the next section is. I'll show you in a second, the threads section. Deirdrick's work is fairly newly acquired in the last 2 years to the museum. He was born and raised in Mexico and Texas. He now lives and works in Los Angeles. And he is a phenomenal artist who really exists between the worlds of craft and fine art, and indeed blurs the boundaries and makes that semantic distinction rather moot in the end. This is one of the largest works he's created. You can see the bench here for scale in a sense. It's 36 feet in its length across these 4 panels. Deirdre is particularly skilled as a weaver. You can see sort of when you come closer up to the work that each of these panels are divided into 3 sections. Each section represents the width of the loom that he can hand weave on. And so he creates these panels in 3 sections and then brings them together. Before he creates each panel, though, he creates a large paper cartoon or a drawing for each of these panels, and indeed for all of his woven works. So much like creating a large history painting, perhaps in the 18th or 19th century, he creates these at scale so that he can map out how he wants his work to occur on the loom. And here he gives us a fairly open-ended scenario or a landscape. We can see in front of us some kind of monument, although it's abbreviated just here, and some of them are already slightly broken. These chains are pulling hard, and they're being pulled by these black silhouettes themselves, almost an homage to an artist of an earlier generation, Cara Walker. Is very important for many younger contemporary artists. And in this sense, Deirdre is giving us something that is both very, very broad in its possibilities for narrative, but very specific in this notion that he very much adheres to, that it is possible to create through acts of destruction or removal, not necessarily violently here, but intentionally and carefully around this monument, pulling it down in order to create a tabula rasa to build up again. And what I like in many ways is this is a provocation, at least when it's on the walls of the museum, to think institutionally how we have many wonderful things that are part of museums that are as old and as storied as ours at the MFA. But there are also things that in the 21st century might need to be broken down, either ideas-wise or physically, in order to be rebuilt again. The other thing I'll leave us with here is something that is very important to Deirdre. The black figures themselves are overlaid, woven on top of the tapestry, and they're woven in acrylic. But the base material here is cotton, and it's hand-dyed. And for Deirdre, that's a particular and very specific and intentional choice. Growing up in the American South, he was deeply aware as a young Black man of the ways in which his ancestors had been made to forcibly pick this kind of material as enslaved people, and the ways in which he wanted to reclaim this particular material in his own work, to have this level of mastery in it if you come up close to it. And I remember the first time our amazing textiles curator, Jen Swope, saw this work, she was completely blown away by his command of his particular craft in hand weaving. And so he chooses this material in order to be able to demonstrate and to tell his own narratives through it with his own agency and with his own decision-making as the artist in this particular scenario. So welcome is the very first thematic section. Threads is our second one. Threads offering, as it says here, either literal or metaphorical forms of care. Threads can be things that keep us safe and warm as garments or forms of clothing. Sometimes they're more metaphorical in threads of identity or ways in which we trace culture through certain forms of art making. And so we have a large section here full of really phenomenal works, including many from our fiber and textile arts collection, although they do range across media. I point out two just here, Walter van Burendank's rather wonderful and provocative Gender on the mannequin on the right, and then a really quiet but beautiful and powerful work by Charles Ledre, who is a New York-based artist. He was born there in 1960, and so he came of age in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis. And many of you might have seen this work. For me, it really does stop me in my tracks every single time as I go past it. It's called ARC Clothesline, ARC standing for AIDS-related complex. And as you can see in the image here, it's made up of very tiny pieces of clothing. He's an artist that does often work in miniature. And he's brought these miniature pieces of clothing together as a way to memorialize friends and loved ones who he lost during the AIDS crisis. And if we think about the ways in which clothing holds very powerful threads of memory, culture, and identity, and the ways in which that often when somebody leaves us, when they die, when they pass, these are the last things that we have of them. They may carry their memory, they may carry it in a very physical way through their scent, or through the ways in which we remember them being worn. And so for him here, this is a textile-based or a fiber-based monument to those people that he had lost during this period of time. In Vibrant Matter, this is a really wonderful, it was a great exploration that we made with Sana, our exhibition designer, in terms of the way in which we brought objects into the space. But Vibrant Matter as a title itself, we wouldn't usually name a thematic section in an exhibition after a work of political theory, but Jane Bennett's book from about a decade ago was one that Kendall and I both really loved. And in it, she makes the argument that things that are not human or animal or plant, so things that are not living organisms, still have the possibility or the capacity to act upon us and for us to act upon them in our lives. They are, she argues, in some sense, alive to us. And we can understand this through many different practices, spiritual and secular across the world. One we often relate it to is, for example, Shintoism, a Japanese spiritual philosophy where inanimate objects like rocks, for example, can have spiritual significance, especially because of the reverence or the care or the tending that somebody might take during their lifetime. And so we thought about that in terms of the way that artists often take materials that are similarly inert and create incredibly vibrant and wonderful works from them. And so this is an image from the original rotation back in July. It's changed a bit since then. Because we've rotated some of the light sensitive artworks, but we brought together a grouping of works here that we felt like created the notion of expression through inert materials. And so these really wonderful viola fry ceramics, for example, we brought together a group of works here that expressed through the notion or the different uses or gestures to human hair. So this rather wonderful Boni Ramirez figure in the painting that has these incredible long tresses, an imagined figure from the Dominican Republic, and specifically his particular region of the Carnival, and a figure from mythology or folklore connected to the Carnival Mosque within the painting. And then on the end just here, we brought together elements that were connected to food. Again, usually an inert material by the time it reaches our plates, but something that is incredibly culturally significant and spiritually significant sometimes as well. And then in the last three sections of the exhibition, we looked at rest. This was a favorite of ours. We got to look through our TMS database with some really key search terms or search words, thinking about repose, curling up, reading, sleeping. And so we have works from across the collection that sometimes quite literally think about or gesture to different forms of rest and the politics behind those forms of being able to take a break. Who gets to and how they get to and when they get to. In the penultimate theme, we look at thresholds, this notion of a boundary between who gets cared for and who doesn't get cared for, and how artists express that through the work that we found in the collection. And so that's done in various ways in this particular section. One of our favorites was this wonderful Lucia Hierro work. It's again a fairly new acquisition, and I'm very grateful to my former colleague Liz Monzel, who is very thoughtful, along with our current colleague Leila Bermeo in the Arts of the Americas, in thinking through collecting Latinx artists for the MFA's collection. So here, Lucia Hierro, a Yale MFA graduate, has created a soft sculpture in the sort of idiom or in the tradition, in a certain sense, of Klaus Oldenburg or Andy Warhol, but has taken it into a very different place in terms of thinking about personal biography and thresholds of care. Here you might recognize some of the elements that she's included. You have some Vicks Vapor Rub, some Pond's cream, although she has included a cheeky reference to art history right in the center of the bag. But these are, for the most part, the kinds of products that she can find when she goes to visit her grandmother in the Dominican Republic. Lucia was born in and still lives in New York City, born in the Bronx, but she maintains a very clear and close connection through her matrilineal line to the Dominican Republic. And so as she travels there and goes back home, she'll either take her grandmother things that her grandma can't find there, or vice versa, will bring back things from the Dominican Republic to her home in New York City. And so she takes what was often in the moment of neo-Dada and pop, something that was very significantly speaking to or even thoroughly embracing capitalist modes of commerce and traversing different boundaries through that, and brings it, as I said, into this very personal space of family and connection and community for her, and ultimately, of course, care. And then in the final section, we look at the notion of adoration, both secular and sacred, a way of caring that artists articulate through their work that can include, as it says here, sort of deep and abiding love, respect, worship, forms of reverence as well. And so across many different works in this particular section, artists are thinking about that notion of attentiveness and how we pay attention to different elements in our life, tending to people, tending to things, tending to ideas as acts of repair or remembrance. And one of the most powerful pairings that I think Kendall and I both absolutely loved in this part of the exhibition, Roseanne Summerson's rather wonderful bench that we see here from the early 1990s. Summerson was, until around 2018, the president of RISD, a really accomplished and wonderful furniture maker and artist who is still here in the New England region and very active. And we paired it as a place to sit and contemplate this rather wonderful 8-panel painting by Joan Snyder that I'll come back to in a second in some subsequent slides and tell you a little bit more about the background of. But this is where the exhibition finishes, and that was sort of the arc of the 6 sections that we have in it. And so, as I said, it was a phenomenal way to get to know a little bit more about the collection itself. It opened last July, and we have had one and we'll have a second opportunity to rotate out some of the works because some of them can only be on view for 6 or 12 months at a time, given their potential light sensitivity. And so what I'd like to do now is tell you a little bit more about the behind the scenes of this exhibition in terms of the rotations that will be coming up, but also importantly in terms of, I think, some of the most unsung heroes of this exhibition and probably every exhibition that happens at the MFA, which are our MFA conservation colleagues. And so I want to share with you 2 behind the scenes stories of bringing some of these works into the Tender Loving Care exhibition. And Joan Snyder's work was one of these stories. You see here 2 out of 3 of the phenomenal conservators who worked on the Joan Snyder painting for quite a while prior to its installation last July. Joel Stevenson is our textile conservator, Katrina Newberry is one of our paper conservators, and then also not pictured here, Sarah Mastrangelo, who is our one of our paintings conservators. And so Joan Snyder's work was brought into the museum in 1986 as a gift to the museum. It was made, it was created in 1977. It's called Resurrection. I'll go back to the slide where you can see the whole of the work. It's a really complex piece. And it hadn't been on view since it came into the museum. So it hadn't been on view for about 40 years. And indeed, we brought Joan to the museum. She very kindly agreed last November, and some of you may have attended, to speak in a lecture talking a little bit about this work alongside Lucia Hierro and Gisela McDaniel, another artist in the exhibition. And she was very moved to see this work. She hadn't seen it since she had made it in 1977. So it was a long time coming for her. She lives and works in Brooklyn. She is still very active and incredibly highly thought of, highly regarded as a painter, now in her late 80s. But in 1977, She created this work in response to what she saw as the sort of wave of misogynistic violence that was occurring in American society and as part of the feminist art movement. And so here across the 8 panels, you see in these 3 just here, and I can show you a close-up in a second in the conservation slides, a collage of newspaper articles that she collected. Her mom also contributed some and collected them, so did some female friends. And they're quite disturbing. They memorialize, or they are newspaper articles about various moments in the mid-1970s that deal with violence against mostly women, although there are some stories of violence against children and elders perpetrated by men. And so alongside these fairly distressing headlines and stories that she's collaged on in these 3 panels, she's pulled out the names of the victims as a way to memorialize them. It's sort of a Me Too before Me Too, saying their name, making sure that they are not forgotten. And then across the ensuing panels, her palette moves from this incredibly deep reds and blacks and blues through this sort of redemptive abstract figure of an angel in the middle, through to a space that is replete with this sort of potential energy for some kind of redemption or resurrection. Thinking through this epidemic of violence and the misogyny that she perceived in society, both at a personal level and then at this more collective level. And evident in the work too is or are elements of wallpaper, of dress paper patterns, of domestic elements that might not usually be seen in a work of this size and scale, and a work that takes on what had until this point in time been a fairly macho and masculine history of abstraction within American painting. And so for her, it was both a deeply personal statement about painting itself, about her art making process itself, but also about the wider world. For us, it was a no-brainer to include in the Tender Loving Care exhibition, but because it hadn't been out on view in over 40 years, it needed some significant conservation work done to it. You can see on the right just here that Katrina is very carefully looking at the edges of where these collage newspapers are on each edge of the 3 panels that the artist has applied them to, and making sure that there are no pieces that are hanging off, that are flaking, that are going to move when they are mounted in the exhibition. Joel is looking very closely because, as I said, this is actually a mixed media work. It looks like a painting, but it includes elements of textiles, of paper, and of painting as well. And so Joel went through and checked every element of the textiles that are peppered throughout the 8 panels to make sure that they were still adhered carefully, and where they weren't, making sure that there were reversible treatments created so that they did adhere and stayed in place during the time that this work would be on exhibition for the 12 months that it will be out. And then Sarah, not pictured, although I'm sure some of these hands must be hers somewhere. Sarah made sure that the painting itself was stable. It came to us without backing. And so she looked at the back of it just here in storage and decided that it should have some backing attached to it, or pardon me, just here. And so this is a way of stabilizing each of the panels so that they don't shift around, so that their surfaces remain in tension, so that the media on those surfaces stays in the way that it's meant to be. And this is the type of work that was done for many of the works in Tender Loving Care, where we really went for the deep cuts of the collection that hadn't been out in a while. And, you know, in some ways, it's no surprise many of these works were by women artists. We were really able to live up to the title of the exhibition of Tender Loving Care in foregrounding collections care as a really deep and important part of the work that was done. This is often very much behind the scenes work. It's not something that's included in the wall label. Maybe if you take a tour with one of the curators, you might hear about it a little bit, but it's not necessarily something that's focused on when visitors come through the galleries. But we simply would not have been able to bring out many of these works from storage had it not been for our conservation colleagues. So the work they do is something that is so important across every single project we do at the MFA, but for TLC, it was absolutely fundamental. I also want to note how important they were to one other work before I take you just through a few of the rotation items and then we get to the Q&A. This was a work that totally fascinated me. I saw it on TMS, again, our electronic, the museum system database. And we acquired this work in 2014, so about 10 years ago, from the artist herself. So it was a gift of the artist. But the incoming registration photo was pretty blurry. So it was not possible to really see it well. And we had to go off site to go see the work and to figure out if we wanted to put it on display. And we went out there with our brilliant objects conservator, one of our objects conservators, Jerry Strickler. And as we unpacked it, we realized that perhaps the reason that it hadn't been out on display in that decade is that it had a significant crack at the top of the work where this lower element meets the top portion of it. So just along here and at the back of it. And so again, we prioritized the time and the funds to make sure that that could be repaired. And it's a fairly complex multi-step process. Whenever any of the conservators are undertaking any type of reparative work, they are always doing it in a way that doesn't change the original aesthetic or intent that the artist may have had for their work. They don't want to do something that isn't reversible in a certain sense. And so they take a lot of time and care. So it's not as straightforward often as I anticipate it to be, certainly without their expertise. And so you see it here, and it's on sort of a reclined base. And we were able to get it to a state of repair that it can be angled in this way. But when it comes off view at the end of TLC, Jerry is going to take a little bit more time and do the next and final step of repairing the crack fully, so that next time somebody wants to come to use this for an exhibition at the MFA, it's actually going to be able to be up on the wall as it should have been. But here, the story of the work is incredibly powerful. Daisy Brand is no longer with us, unfortunately, but she was based in Boston and New England. And she worked in ceramics for a very, very long period, multiple decades. She was a graduate of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And that was also an important part of TLC. We have about 25 of the 100 works. The artists have significant connections to either Boston or the New England area. Perhaps like Daisy, they went to school in the region. Some of them still teach here, or they have lived and worked in Boston in other ways. So Daisy came to the SMFA and graduated in 1965. And she was one of only 2 members of her family who managed to escape Auschwitz. So she came to the United States, and I'm paraphrasing, but I read a very powerful interview quote with her as we were researching this work, saying that she wanted something good to come out of the potential of fire, out of the kiln. And so she really dedicated her life in many ways to ceramics. Often in her work, as you see here, we're looking into a space that is not didactic. She's not necessarily telling us where we are, much like Deirdre. She's sort of leaving it as an open-ended question. But she's thinking of architectural spaces a lot of the time through her ceramic work, and thinking about the ways in which these spaces might convey some kind of memory, sometimes ambiguously, perhaps for her good, perhaps for her bad, but letting us see in some sense into that memory through the work that she gives us. What very much moved me is that although she was not able to come and see her work, one of the very first visitors we had on the first day that we were open was her son, Alan. And he was able to bring family members to see his mother's work. And so for me, for Kendall, for the whole team putting together TLC, that we were able to get out works that hadn't previously been ready for display, and that so many of these works were by women artists whose work is incredibly powerful. We have so many really strong works in the museum's collection. For us, it was very meaningful. And I just want to underscore again, it would not have happened without our conservation colleagues. And so I'm going to end this evening by giving you a little taste of some of the works that are going to be coming up in the next rotation in July. And so if you're in the TLC galleries now, between now and the end of July, it'll remain as it is. And then towards the end of July, we're going to rotate out about 50 works because of light sensitivity. Some will have already been out for 12 months, some will have been out for 6 months. There are different lengths of time. Paper and photo can be out rather than perhaps glass fiber. And so I'm not going to share all 50 of them with you. Come back and take a look in the galleries themselves. But I wanted to share just a few here as kind of a taster for what is coming up. And I think this is the first time we've shared any of these. And so you are the first to get to see them. And again, they really range, as the whole exhibition does, across media and across our contemporary holdings. And so these are some of my favorites. I know it's a little unusual to have fish decoys out in a contemporary exhibition. But as Kimberly mentioned, as she was very kindly introducing me, part of my research over the last 3 years has been going across the United States and looking at craft and folk art. And we have such a strong program for it within the contemporary holdings here. I'm very lucky to work with other colleagues, including Michael Bramwell in our Arts of Americas department. And these I came across when I was in North Dakota. They are made by Rick and Connie Whittier, who are retired law enforcement officers, and they live in a very small town called Lidgerwood in North Dakota. And they have, for a very long time, for all of their lives, really grown up doing spear fishing, which you need to use a decoy, a fish decoy that runs through the water in order to attract the fish to then be able to spear it. So it's a method of fishing found in North and South Dakota, but also in Montana, Minnesota, and Michigan. And very early examples of these kinds of decoys are actually rooted in indigenous practices of that particular region. But what I loved when I went to visit Rick and Connie and see their work, I went to their home. I actually went down into their basement. These are some of the pictures that I took there. They make these wooden templates. They weight them. And so when you move them through water, they really feel like the fish are swimming. Then they hang them up on these hooks, and then they spray paint them. And this was about the time actually that we had the Basquiat exhibition at the museum. And it really reminded me of the ways in which graffiti artists also freestyle with paint cans in this sense. They have an encyclopedic knowledge of the different fish of the region, and they will use different methods of spray painting freehand in order to create the right kind of colorways so that they read correctly underwater. And one of my favorite parts of seeing how they worked was they really do sort of improvise in terms of their tools, and some of them are really low key, including a snow cone with the end chopped off so that Rick could make little dots across some of the fish that he was creating. Another work that we're really, really pleased to be able to put on display is Tanya Crane's really beautiful enamel bowl, Miguel's story, that comes in as a really important and very much appreciated gift from the Enamel Arts Foundation. Tanya is a professor of the practice over the roads at the SMFA. So again, that really important local connection. Boston and the surrounds are so full of incredible contemporary artists. And here, this work is part of a long arc of research into interviews done. Tanya has interviewed many members of her family as part of this sort of larger project that she has, creating her family's or connecting her family's stories back to the Great Migration, the movement of Black Americans from the South across the country in the early and mid part of the 20th century. And so she's particularly interested in the ways that her family stories are connected to that larger social and cultural and political movement of people across the United States. And Miguel is her uncle. So that's the uncle for whom this particular piece is named. He lives in South Central in Los Angeles. He's one of her last living relatives on her father's side. And when you turn the bowl over, there are words that she has etched into the enamel from that particular interview. What you see here is the outside of the bowl, which has tick marks that represent the time he spent imprisoned, and also detail part of the kind of recollections of time across the interviews that she has done with the family members that she has spoken with, and the ways in which their challenges and triumphs have shaped her family history. I'm really pleased also that we're going to have two works by two artists still living and still working in Boston and the New England region, Joanne Rothschild, whose work you see on the left, and Catherine McCarthy, whose work you see on the right. And both of them were Maud Morgan Prize winners at the museum. And in fact, Joanne was the inaugural Maud Morgan Prize winner in 1993, which is when this work came into our collection. And so Here, actually, you see a little bit of behind the scenes. This was us again. And now I can actually share with you a picture of Sarah Mastrangelo and my other really great colleagues, Andy and Lisa, who maintain our offsite storage. And this is Rachel, who's another paintings conservator who has been equally wonderful to work with. And we are here looking at Joanne's work, which hasn't been on view since her Maud Morgan Prize reception in the early 1990s. And much like Joan Snyder's work, this at first glance seems like an abstract painting. It's very large in scale, as you can see here, being unrolled as it's being checked in our offsite storage. It has a very bold contrast between the dark and fairly foreboding perimeter, and then this very sort of expressive and layered interior. And the title of the work itself memorializes a news item that some Bostonians might remember if they have lived in the city over several decades. There was a very brutal assault and murder of a young woman, Kimberly Ray Harbor, that occurred in Franklin Field in Dorchester in 1990. And Rothschild has dedicated many, many, many years of her work as a painter to thinking through formal and gestural abstract elements of painting, for sure, but also thinking about foregrounding aspects of women's lives that are often forgotten or deliberately ignored, both inside and outside of the art world. And so we felt that her act of bearing witness to this event through this particular painting was a form of care, and we were very excited to think about including it in this particular collection exhibition dedicated to that particular theme. And then Catherine McCarthy, this work will go in the Adoration section. We're looking here at the Dowry, painted in 1994, so just a year after Joanne's in Franklin Field. And here, as you can see, it really reads as this rather wonderful, monumental, it's really large, virgin figure. McCarthy is one of 7 Irish Catholic sisters from Lowell in Massachusetts, and she's long been interested in investigating women's roles and female archetypes in society and in art. And she does this through a range of different methods, often looking to things like Grimm's fairy tales, fashion magazines, handicraft, and other subjects that are traditionally coded as feminine and often, because of that, socially marginalized. And so here, this work is actually much like panel paintings of the Renaissance period. This is also 2 vertically conjoined canvases. So you see the split just here that joins the top to the bottom. And each of them explores a fairly unrealistic standard by which women are measured. You had this very pious Virgin Mary dominating the upper canvas, while at her feet you have tiny figures just here of different fashion models that fill the lower one. And the title of the work itself, the dowry, refers to the property or money traditionally brought to a bride's husband upon their wedding, referencing, at least in the artist's eyes, another method of stripping social and political power from women and reducing them to their physical or material values. So here, 2 artists who are really thinking through stereotypes and archetypes of the female form and female histories, and finding new ways to help us think through them and the ways in which they, as acts of care, bear witness to them. And then finally, I want to talk about a really special loan that we will have for the last part of this exhibition. A really, really wonderful Alice Neal work, one of the very last that she made before her death in 1984. And this is from Dr. and Mrs. Deneen, who are here in Boston. And it comes with a really beautiful story that they were able to share with me when I visited this work at home with them a couple of months ago. And they very kindly said that I could share this image here from their photo album. This is Alice Neal painting Dr. Deneen back in 1984. And this is the beginning of the portrait that you see on the left just here that will be part of our Adoration section as well. And Neil met Dr. Deneen, who was an internist at the time at Mass General Hospital in the late 1970s. She had begun to have health issues, and she was not making much progress with doctors in her home city of New York. And so her son, Hartley, who was a radiology fellow at MGH, asked his senior colleague, Dr. Deneen, who you see here, if he would review his mother's case. And Dr. Deneen did. He successfully treated the artist with a pacemaker, and she trusted him. You know, when you find a great doctor, that was Dr. Deneen for the rest of her life. And so in the very last year of her life, she invited him to her summer home in New Jersey. And Dr. Deneen recalls it being a very hot day in May of 1984. And it was about 5 months before her eventual death. And he sat outside in her garden while she painted him. And so his portrait here, I felt, captured somebody who was an everyday acquaintance, much like the rest of her portraiture oeuvre, certainly. But it's also, very importantly, I think, for her and for him too, somebody who is very touched by this particular relationship and by this painting or portrait that came from it. It's a record of a man who took the time to look at her as a whole person and treat her with care, as she did to him in turn while making this work. And so for me, it fits rather beautifully within the parameters of this exhibition, and will be one of the last things that people see as they leave the galleries from July onwards. This very personal monument to the ways in which we can care for one another, how an artist's work depicts an act of care that she received from her doctor, and vice versa, how an artist cared for him as her subject and her sitter. So I will leave it there just now. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. And so, Kimberly, I know that you have been looking at the Q&A section. And if anybody has any questions at all, either about something I covered or about something that I didn't and you would like to know, then please just let me know and I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This has been great, a great overview of TLC. We do have a question from Lori about the definition of the time period for contemporary art.
It's a really good question, Laurie. Every museum does it differently, and indeed every curator has a bit of a different answer. Technically at the MFA, the definition for contemporary art in terms of era is 1955 to the present. But like any so-called encyclopedic museum, contemporary art lives across different departments. So it's not really just in contemporary. And I have to shout out to the colleagues who helped make TLC possible. I worked with 7 different curatorial departments to bring works into this particular collection show. So photography, prints, drawings, textile and fiber arts, etc. And for each of those departments, they may have slightly different boundaries in terms of what they call contemporary. Then there's always the question of, for contemporary artists, people often associate that with living artists. And of course, there are some works in our collection holdings now, and indeed in this exhibition, where the artist is no longer alive, Alice Neal being one of those examples. So there's a technical answer to your question, which is 1955 to the present. But I think one of the joys and difficulties with contemporary art is that that is an ever-moving goalpost. And so I think there will be a moment in the future when the notion of contemporary, we either have to say, well, contemporary meant 1955 to 2050, and now we call it something different after that. Or 10, 15, 50 years from now, contemporary means the art of our time, which is often a common definition of contemporary art. And so the era specificity might shift in a historical collection like ours, where something that is made in the late 20th century might no longer be considered contemporary. But at the moment, it's 1955 to the present.
Thank you, Michelle. Louise Mary wants to say thank you and that this was great. And we'll wait for just a minute to see if there are other questions. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box below. And
if you don't, then I hope I see you in the TLC galleries. If you see me, if you remember and you're walking through the galleries, I'm often in there, either giving a tour or checking on a work, or thinking about measuring something with Sana, our exhibition designer. And so if you see me walking through, please stop me and say hello. And if you have questions about the rest of the exhibition as you're looking through, then I'm really happy to answer them in person too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It looks like there are no more questions. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend the evening with us. Oh, I said
Great.
that and another question.
Good.
So an anonymous attendee wants to know if other museums have similar themed exhibitions.
Yes, they do. I think every museum does it in their own way. Certainly, there are themed exhibitions in encyclopedic museum collections and in smaller museums too, where they're thinking about innovative ways to bring works out of their collection. Before coming to the MFA, I worked at MoMA and at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I know there that we also thought about things thematically from the collection. I was part of an experiment in 2016 at MoMA where we thought about eras as themes. It ties perfectly to the earlier question about what time period constitutes contemporary art. Now, if you go to MoMA, you will actually see a lot of the collection divided along the notion of time of different eras rather than through a particular theme or idea, although there are subrooms developed or connected to specific themes or ideas. And so at MoMA, they took that template that we sort of pioneered or tried out in 2016. We looked at the decade of the 1960s. And that's how they have now organized their new permanent collection galleries. At the Philadelphia Museum of Art, certainly there were thematic ways in which we dealt with I was part of the decorative arts department there. And we looked at themes of perhaps nature, and we're able to get things out from across our contemporary decorative arts, modern contemporary decorative arts collection. So yes, museums do use thematic, often broad thematic buckets to bring out the collection in certain ways. They also have been known to invite contemporary artists in. There's the notion of the artist as the curator. And again, MoMA certainly has dug into that through their Artist's Choice series. But perhaps one of the earliest examples actually is the Raid the Icebox series that happened at RISD, where they invited Andy Warhol many decades ago to come into the museum and to look through their collection anew with sort of fresh eyes from the outside by pulling out things that he was particularly interested in. And so, yes, it is not just something that the MFA does, but for us, it was a really wonderful way to think through the many different media that we collect in the contemporary department. As I said earlier, I'm really proud to be part of a department that has thought carefully about material culture, craft, and folk art, actually, as part of contemporary expressions across the United States and beyond. That's quite unusual. Usually those areas of media-specific practice are, the polite word may be put in a different department. The blunt word might be marginalized. They're not often seen within the hierarchy of contemporary art as something that should be collected, celebrated, seen in the same space as painting, sculpture, installation, time-based media. And so for us, using this thematic approach was a way to think about making across many different media for many different reasons.
Thank you. One attendee wonders whether there were any items you wish you could have included, but space didn't allow for it.
Oh, that's such a great question. Many. I'm trying to remember back. We had probably a year where Kendall and I would dig through the collection, and then put them all up in a pinup on our wall in the contemporary department and think through what made sense together thematically, like what fit into this theme of care and what we can fit. I think actually maybe more so than or less so than fitting, it wasn't necessarily space. It was that there were some works that maybe need a little bit more TLC, need some conservation. And so we had to prioritize. We have a brilliant conservation team, but they have a bandwidth. And so they couldn't necessarily conserve everything that we had on our list. There were also some artworks that were going to be used in other exhibitions that were upcoming, or artworks, especially prints and photo, that had been used recently. And so we couldn't get out because it would not have been responsible. I think the rule is that if something is out on display for 1 month, it has to go to bed for 1 year. That rule is sometimes broken. If a big retrospective of an artist comes up and we hold a significant work by them, we might well say, well, even if it has been out very recently, we will let you use this because it's important in that particular context. But there were certainly some items on the list where we wanted to use them. They fit perfectly in terms of one theme, but they had been out very recently at the museum, and we would have been breaking the rule of conservation were we to put them into TLC again. And so we, in that case, just searched for another work on our list that would be equally as effective, and we'll bide our time. And when we can go back to those works, we will. But for now, we want to make sure that they can be seen in the long run by people coming to the museum many decades from now.
Great. Are there any photos in the exhibit?
Yes, many. I don't have a number off the top of my head because that has actually changed over time because we've done rotations. But there are works across every media that we collect in contemporary, apart from time-based media, which we currently have a special exhibition space dedicated to, the Krupp Gallery, which is connected to and adjacent to the Lindy Galleries, where this exhibition is. So right now, my colleague Theo Tyson has a really brilliant exhibition for women, which is the time-based media component. But yes, we have plenty of photographs. I'm thinking just now we have in the threshold section, for example, a wonderful mass art professor, S. Billy Mandel, has a diptych of really beautiful large format images of the interiors of confessional spaces. We have photographs in the rest section that's actually heavily dominated by photography in that particular space. And then in Adoration, we have some really wonderful photographs too. One, for example, by the artist Jimmy DeSana. So there's photography right the way throughout the exhibition.
Great. So we have time for just one last quick question. And can you remind us the last date before the exhibition turns over?
Yes, absolutely. If you come on any time before July 14, the week of July 15th is when the rotation is happening. So you will see me in the galleries then. We won't be shutting off all of the galleries. So if you're passing through that space, then come in and wave and say hi, and you might see some of the rotations happening. But July 14th is where the exhibition will be as it is now. And then July 15th, that week, we will be rotating and reinstalling, and then we will open up afresh until January of 2025.
Great. Michelle, thank you again for taking the time. This was great. And thanks very much for everyone who was able to join us, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody who came along. It's such a joy to share the works that we have at the MFA, and please say hi if you see me in the gallery. Bye.
Bye.